I grew up in a narrow apartment over a hardware store that always smelled like dust, rope, and something metallic. My mother kept our place neat in the way of people who believe tidiness can keep misfortune from noticing them. The windows looked out on the streetcar line. On good nights, I fell asleep to the gentle clack of wheels and the murmur of people going home. On the table by the kitchen window, my mother kept a ledger. Not a journal, not a cookbook. A ledger, pale green columns. Thin lines, months stacked like layers in sediment. Money in, money out, dates, initials, notes that made more sense to her than to anyone else. I learned my multiplication tables by watching her pencil float over numbers. By the time I was 12, I understood that everything in our home was ranked by utility. Useful things were cherished. The washing machine that never broke, the thick kettle that boiled water, even when the stove hissed unevenly. Useless things were indulgences. I kept mine small. A library card, a tin of colored pencils, a collection of bus tickets I pressed flat under a book like leaves. My mother's job was selling apartment buildings no one wanted and neighborhoods no one visited. She called herself a facilitator when people asked. She had a script that sounded like honesty with the corners filed down, great bones, lots of potential, you can make it your own. She came home late, took off her shoes before she spoke, and if the day had gone poorly her voice would reach for gentleness it didn't have. I studied accounting because I'd been taught that money is simply a language you have to learn if you want to survive. I liked balancing things. I liked the clean click when a column reconciled. I got a job in a small firm that did taxes for people who were too busy or too tired to do their own. The office was on the second floor over a bakery. Our lobby smelled like sugar and resignation in April. I wore sensible shoes and neutral sweaters. I texted my mother to ask if she needed anything from the market. She answered in emojis only when she was relieved. We lived quietly, two women in parallel lanes, heads down, feet steady. My father existed in the ledger only as a pair of initials next to a number that had stopped appearing before I learned to write my name. My mother used to say, he was good until he wasn't, and I didn't ask questions because questions don't change balances. I met Daniel in winter when the city turned to a map of salt stains. He was an old client of the firm, the kind who arrived with a paper bag of receipts and a shame-faced smile. He worked in property redevelopment, which is what you call it when you buy broken things and sell them as possibilities. He was 10 years older than me, handsome in the way of people who sleep less than they should and forgive themselves with good habits. He asked me questions like he was filing them away. Favorite tea, favorite bus route, favorite day of the week. He made it feel like my answers could solve things. When I told my mother about him, her eyes flickered with a calculation I knew too well. Then she smiled, just a little, like someone approving a number that wasn't as bad as she feared. Be careful, she said, which was how she said be happy. I didn't know then that she had her own name for Daniel. She called him before, and she never said it out loud. It was spring when the first real hint arrived. I was at my mother's kitchen table. She had gone to make tea, her phone, face down, buzzed with the kind of insistence that belongs to debt collectors and old friends. I didn't touch it. I had learned young that privacy is the one indulgence poor families can afford. When she returned, she tilted the phone, scanned something, and smiled in a way I'd never seen. It made her look softer and older at the same time. Who is it? I asked gently. She shrugged. An old colleague. Long story. My mother had many long stories that she preferred short. 2 weeks later, I came home late and found her already at the table, the ledger open, a glass of wine half gone. She had drawn a line down one page and written 2 words at the top. What's left? My name appeared twice under the column of assets. Her handwriting looked tired. Are we in trouble? I asked. We're in reality, she said. Trouble is just reality with worse lighting. I sat. She turned the ledger toward me. There were numbers I recognized: mortgage, utilities, taxes. There were numbers I did not: private note, bridge loan, accrued interest, a series of payments to a law firm I'd only seen on signs near the courthouse. She closed the book before I could read more. This isn't yours to fix, she said, but I knew what that meant in our house. Everything was everyone's to fix. Summer came. Daniel and I unlearned each other's edges slowly, the way careful people do when they want to be sure. He told me about the first building he'd flipped, the one with rotten beams that he saved with patience, and a contractor who didn't lie. He told me about his mother, a woman who taught high school English and measured love in dinners. He told me about his father only once. It was enough. One Sunday, my mother invited us both to lunch. She cooked roast chicken like a promise. She wore a blouse I hadn't seen since I was young, a soft blue that made her look like a person who believed in weekends. Daniel brought a bottle of wine and flowers. My mother sniffed the cork with efficient approval and put the flowers in a jar that had once held pickles. We sat, we ate, we performed normalcy. When Daniel left to catch a meeting, my mother stood at the window and watched him cross the street. What do you think? she asked, still looking out. I think he's kind, I said. And steady, she smiled without showing teeth. Steady is a rare quality. I don't know when I began to suspect they knew each other from long ago. Maybe it was the way she remembered his birthday without asking, or how he knew the brand of tea she liked without being told. Maybe it was the way he said her name the first time, as if he'd tried on all the shapes of it in his mouth over the years and had settled on the one that didn't hurt. The reveal came like most truths in my family, not with a bang, but with a sigh. I was early to my mother's one evening and used my key. The apartment smelled like lemon oil and something floral. Voices came from the kitchen. I stopped in the hall, not because I wanted to listen, but because the tone of a room tells you what a transcript cannot. I can't, Daniel was saying, quietly. It's not right. It's practical, my mother answered, and practical is just morality with good math. Silence stretched. A chair leg scraped. I stepped forward then, so my arrival would break the scene rather than expose it. My mother turned, smooth and composed, as if we were all exactly where we were supposed to be. Daniel looked at the floor, then up at me, face careful. Hi, I said, because sometimes the only weapon you have is courtesy. Hi, he echoed. He held my gaze a second too long, apology in the corners. We ate in a politeness that made my shoulders ache. After, when Daniel had gone, my mother set the plates in the sink and turned on the water. Explain, I said softly. There was a loan. I helped him with a down payment on his first building. He promised a return I didn't get. I was foolish. I was in love, she looked at me then, eyes bright with the kind of anger that survives love and outlasts it. He owes me, she said, each word set down like currency on a table. He owes us. You invited him back, I said. It wasn't a question, he came back, she said. You invited him in. I felt like the room had shifted a few inches to the left. What exactly are you asking of him? I asked. My voice sounded unsentimental and older. I'm asking that the ledger balances, she said. If not in money, then in security. The word hung in the air like a damp coat. Security for whom, I asked, though I knew. I had always known. For you, she said, quick. Then added, less convincingly, for us. In the weeks that followed, our lives narrowed. My mother called it focusing on the essential. I called it not drowning. The ledger grew stricter. The column labeled bridge loan sprouted tendrils. I learned the names of creditors the way other people memorize politicians. Daniel noticed the change and asked careful questions that gave me room to answer or not. He brought groceries without comment, recooked leftovers like inventions, sat on the sofa with me, and pressed his knee against mine in a way that felt like a vow. One evening, he took me to dinner at a quiet place with white tablecloths and no music. He wore a jacket. I wore mascara and the necklace my mother had given me on my 21st birthday, a small gold pendant that had belonged to my grandmother, whose ledger my mother had inherited. We ate slowly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring. It was simple and elegant, a circle of light in a dark room. He didn't kneel. He wasn't theatrical. He looked at me as if I were a house he wanted to live in a very long time. Marry me, he said. Not because it's time. Because it's us, I believed him. I said yes. The next morning, my mother hugged me for the first time in months. She held on longer than either of us expected. You did well, she said, then corrected herself. You chose well. We began planning with a thrift that pretended to be an aesthetic. Small ceremony, no band, a dress I found on consignment, and altered myself with a friend's sewing machine. Daniel covered most of the costs. My mother contributed in ways that looked like favors called in. She introduced us to a lawyer who would draft a prenuptial agreement. It's practical, she told me, as if romance and prudence were partners in a dance I had finally learned. The lawyer's office had windows so clean they looked like absence. She asked us questions in a tone that made them sound like weather. Assets, incomes, obligations. When we reached the part about premarital debts, the air in the room changed temperature. Do either of you have personal loans or liabilities not already listed? The lawyer asked, looking at Daniel first. He glanced at me, a flicker. Then he said, No, the moment was small enough to miss if you weren't a person who survives by catching small things. I said nothing in the office. In the elevator, I said, You told the truth. He flinched like I'd slapped him. What did you think I would do? Match the lighting, I said. My mother adjusts brightness. Sometimes I forget other people use switches. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them and covered my hand with his. Your mother has lived too long alone with the ledger, he said. It makes everything look like a column. We set a date for autumn. The days drifted toward it like leaves toward a drain. My mother called carpenters and a florist she liked because he owed her a favor. Daniel booked the venue and found a friend with a camera who could make ordinary things look expensive. I worked, slept, tried not to dream numbers. 2 months before the wedding, I was at my mother's apartment looking for ribbon when I opened the wrong drawer. Paper slid, an old contract. Brittle at the edges. My mother's name, Daniel's name, a date from years ago. A handwritten amendment, a note about repayment in kind if cash was unavailable. The language was vague in a way that made my throat close. I stood there for a long minute, the way you do when your body knows before your mind lets itself know. Then I put the paper back exactly as I found it, took the ribbon, tied it around the bouquet of programs, and went home. That night, I asked Daniel if he had ever signed anything with my mother. His face changed to a version that made me wish I had asked sooner. I was 25, he said. I thought I could carry 3 mortgages on charm and will. Your mother believed in me, or believed in the version of me she wanted to be right about. And repayment? I asked. I repaid the cash within 2 years, he said, firm, with interest. She asked for something else later, when the second building fell through. She asked for another chance. I said, no, we ended badly. Did you know she still had the contract? I asked. He shook his head. I assumed she tore it up the day we stopped speaking. My mother had never told me. She had kept it next to rubber bands and birthday candles, a filed-away hope. The week after, she called me for coffee and brought me a stack of recipes she'd copied carefully, in case I wanted to start a family book. Halfway through the second cup, she slid a folded paper across to me and said, I need you to be wise. It was the old contract. It looked more fragile in daylight. I don't want to see it, I said. You need to, she said. You need to understand that I have invested everything in you. I am not an investment, I said, more sharply than I intended. People at nearby tables turned their heads. I lowered my voice. I love him. He loves me. She became very, very calm. Love fades, she said. Security doesn't. There it was. The moral of her ledger. What are you asking me to do? I asked. Ensure, she said. Ensure that what should be returned to this family is returned. I don't care in what form, and suddenly I could see it all, as if someone had turned on a bright, unflattering light. The careful dinners, the invitations, the long, slow dance around confession. She had curated our lives into a repayment plan. I went home and lay on the floor because chairs felt like too much ceremony. When Daniel arrived, he sat beside me and looked at the ceiling too. Tell me, he said simply. I told him everything. The contract, the conversation, the shape of my mother's hope. I didn't cry, I didn't rage. I spoke like an accountant reading a statement into the record. He listened. When I finished, he said, we can cancel. The relief that washed over me was so sudden and fierce, I mistook it for grief. She will never forgive me, I said. He nodded. But you will survive, I shook my head. I'm tired of surviving. I want to build, he took my hand. Then we build. We didn't cancel the wedding. We changed the terms. The next day, we met with the lawyer again. We added a clause that made my mother's old contract null and void in any form. Daniel insisted on one more, a separate account for my mother's living expenses for the next 2 years, funded by us, managed by me, with explicit boundaries and monthly statements. He called it a soft landing. I called it the line I needed to be able to cross the room. The morning I brought the documents to my mother, she read them with a stillness that reminded me of snow before the roof caves. She signed when she saw the living expenses clause. Her signature shook just a little. Then she pushed the papers back to me and said, You've made your choice. I said, So have you. We married in the small hall with high windows and a floor that glowed. There were flowers I couldn't name and music I didn't recognize. My mother wore the blue blouse and stood near the back, hands folded, face like a locked drawer. When we said our vows, I looked at Daniel and felt a quiet like a room after the last guest leaves. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't relief. It was steadiness. The thing I had told my mother he was. After, my mother hugged me and whispered, Be practical, which was as close to blessing as she could come. We built a life that didn't put us in anyone's ledger. A small apartment with a balcony, plants, learn to forgive. 2 jobs that fit together without grinding. Evenings compiling budgets that looked like maps of places we wanted to go. A house with enough light, a dog, maybe children if the arithmetic of our days allowed for it. I called my mother once a week. I sent the monthly statements for her account. Sometimes she replied with a single word, received. Sometimes she sent a photo of the market flowers she'd bought on sale, and for a second I could almost pretend we were 2 women discussing color instead of control. Months later, I went to her apartment and found her at the table, the ledger closed. She looked tired, but something behind her eyes had unclenched. She poured tea, pushed a plate of cookies toward me, and said, Tell me about your work, I told her. When I finished, she nodded like a judge announcing a verdict. Then she said very quietly, I'm sorry I tried to make you a solution. It was not everything. It was not enough. It was perhaps all she had. I'm sorry you had to, I said. I know what fear costs. We didn't mention the contract again. We did talk over time about small things, neighbors, recipes, bus routes. Once she laughed at a joke I made and it sounded like a window opening. The moral came to me in a grocery store aisle while I compared prices on beans. I do not owe anyone the shape of my life, not even the woman who gave me one. Debt and love are different languages. Confuse them and you will spend your days balancing columns that never close. My mother still keeps her ledger. I keep mine too, but it's a different kind. It has categories like kindness, sleep, an evening with friends, a walk that made the city look like a kinder place. On its best days, it balances without effort. Sometimes, when the streetcar passes our building at night, I hear the old sound from my childhood and feel the tug of a life lived by numbers that were always slightly short. I close my eyes and hold Daniel's hand and remind myself that we built something slower and sturdier than urgency. Not fireworks, not even flowers, just a table by a window where, for the first time, no one is keeping score. If there's a lesson, it's this: you can't repay the past by mortgaging the future. You can love your mother and still refuse her terms. You can choose a steady life over a balanced ledger. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do is to put the pen down and walk out into the light.